At the back there. My name is John Terpstra. I'm CTO of Premastasis Incorporated. I'll just give a little bit of my background. Prior to being with Premastasis, I was with Caldera. I was VP of Technology. I was responsible for the unification of the technologies that were used over the top of Caldera's Open Linux product, their Open Server and their Unixware product. I was also deeply involved and intimately involved in the creation of United Linux, which was a consortium of Turbo Linux, Caldera, SUSE, and Conectiva from Brazil, which resulted in the integration of the various language features and wide character set features that each distribution was using into a common code base, and that code base is now in Novell's Linux products. Prior to working with Caldera, I was with Turbo Linux. I've been involved in the Linux Standards Base Initiative, in the Linux Internationalization Initiative, now Open 18NUX, and I have been involved in the standards process for just a little over 15 years. I have dealt with large organizations and governments, and over the last 3 years have provided consultative services in the area of anticipating the consequences of deploying open source software in both businesses and governments. In September 2004, I was involved in organizing and running a conference based out of Scottsdale, Arizona, called Open Source and Open Standards. I believe that standards are quite tangential to open source. The fact that you have code doesn't mean that it is a standard, and it is the question of what constitutes a standard and why are standards important that has driven much of my motivation over the last 3 years and will probably continue well into the future. At the end of 2004, it was my privilege to run workshops with the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister in London. I had meetings with the European Union Policy Directorate on Information and Communications Technologies. I also gave a presentation on the importance of open public royalty-free standards to the European Standard Telecommunications Institute in Nice in France. I guess it would be no exaggeration, therefore, to say that standards are close to my heart, and when Scott asked me to speak to the subject here this morning in this keynote of standards in government, innovation, equality, and access, I thought, what a mismatch, what an impossible task, and what an impossible number of particular bullet points that I would need to hit. So I decided that what I should do is define my terms, identify the problems and opportunities, and perhaps describe the present dilemma. So looking at the definition of terms, I thought, what better dictionary can one turn to than one that hasn't changed for a while? Now, I don't know if you catch the irony of that. A dictionary that has not changed for a while. That leaves us with very few choices in North America. So I chose Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. I think you'll all agree that hasn't changed for a while. So what I thought I would do is dissect what each of the words in the subject meant so that I could come to a better understanding of what I should be speaking about. I guess you can draw your own conclusions from the overview of that. So what is a standard? It is a rule or model by the authority of public opinion or by respectable opinions or custom or general consent. Other references in the definition describe a standard as a measure of conformance or value or commonality with general public acceptance. Now, I wonder who this public might be, and I wonder what general public acceptance might really mean. But it is the last line that that got my attention more and struck me right at my core. A model of authority or excellence is a single file format, for example. In the case of the Microsoft Word format, let's just confine ourselves to that for one moment, is the fact that it is used by everyone sufficient to give it, to classify it as a model of authority or excellence, or is it simply a default that nobody has managed to find a better answer to? In which case, we really ought to be seeking the better answer, the better solution. So let's move on. The term government is defined by Noah Webster's dictionary as the system of polity in a state, that form of fundamental rules and principles by which a nation or state is governed, or by which individual members of a body politic are to regulate their social actions. A constitution, either written or unwritten, by which the rights and duties of citizens and public officers are prescribed and defined, as a monarchical government or a republican government. Fascinating. Rules that public officers might need to comply with, that's a fascinating new concept, if ever there was one in the 21st century world. So what is innovation? We all know what innovation is. After all, our governments around the world have been embracing intellectual property constraints and laws to foster innovation. So therefore, clearly we must all understand what innovation is. Well, according to Noah Webster again, it's change made by introduction of something new, change in established laws, customs, rights, or practices. Innovation is expedient when it remedies an evil and safe when men are prepared to receive it. Unfortunately, prior to our recent times, the term innovation was generally used in a condescending and ill sense for a change that disturbs settled opinions and practices without an equivalent advantage. Do we want to disturb everything without an advantage? I guess not. So far we've looked at 3 of the 5 words in my title, in the title of this session. So I thought I'd look at the term equality. Now I thought I knew what equality meant. According to Noah Webster again, it's an agreement of things in dimensions, quantity or quality, likeness, similarity in regard of 2 things compared, the same degree of dignity or claims as the equality of men in the scale of being, the equality of nobles of the same rank, or an equality of rights, evenness, uniformity, and plainness. So, lastly, what does access mean? A coming to, near approach, admission as to gain access to a prince. A means of approach, liberty to approach, implying previous obstacles, the result of which is an increase in wealth or territory, together with a right to the thing added or to the improvement thereof. Notice the concept of the right to the thing added. So therefore, that got me thinking, if we do not have totally unfettered rights, what right do we have in respect of a document format like the .doc format? Or, heaven forbid, a patented closed format subject to digital rights management constraints that make it illegal for anyone to reverse engineer any form of interoperability. That means you have the right to use it while you comply with certain licensing provisions and rights, certainly not uniformly upon everyone, unless everyone is coerced to purchase the same software. So therefore, in summary of what my topic is today, it is the standards in government, which is the authoritative rules that regulate the rights and duties of public officials in respect of change of law, custom or practice to remove an evil, to which are attached the same degree of dignity or rights in liberty to approach with a right to the thing added. Public documents are created to inform the public today and in perpetuity, and therefore if we place an obstacle to the mechanism and to the objective of passing on information, some form of intellectual property constraint, then we are impeding the very purpose for which those documents are created. So therefore it is quite important that we do identify the problems and the opportunities. What I'm going to talk about is standards, the general attributes of standards, the key concern emotionally and politically in the discussion and the debate about standards. I want to attempt to define an open standard, and I want to look at the impact of standards. First of all, the attributes of information technology standards. They must be adopted uniformly in order to fit the bill and purpose that defines them as open standards. They need to be adopted uniformly by all who govern both privately and publicly, without prejudice or condition. They also need to be protected and managed through a process of due and open public interaction. And they need to be seen as a safeguard against potential risks and exposure. And that requires an ongoing analysis and assessment of the impact of the standard. It requires a particularly long-term view and perspective. It must be accompanied by public acceptance. It must be accompanied by broad spread adoption, and it must be maintained. The problem today is that the open standards debate is seen by many as being specifically and inherently anti-Microsoft. Others see the standardization process as something pro-software socialism, or pro-big business if they can get appropriate royalties and constraints attached to the standard. We need to go back and avoid those peripheral polarizing issues and focus on the technical issues, why we need the standards, and what the implications of the adoptions of standards are. We need to get away from emotions and focus on facts. Now, to begin with, we need to address the question of what does open mean? There must be agreement about this. Through the 1970s and 1980s, we saw increasing waves of companies embracing the term open. Unix was declared to be an open system, even though it was subject to severe licensing constraints. IBM proposed that their VMS operating system was an open system. Others have declared various rather restrictively licensed systems as very open. What does open mean? We'll come back to that. The key players or areas of influence in a standard are those who create it, those who deploy it and implement it, and those who consume the benefits of it. Well, let's look at the key issues for each of them. Before we do, I'd like to cover the conditions of open standards. An open standard is one that permits open, that is unconstrained, public interaction and participation throughout the process of creating the standard. An open standard requires consensus without any one party domineering or forcing a particular conclusion. An open standard requires due process that permits all voices that are necessary to be voiced, to be duly heard and considered. It requires open intellectual property rights so that the standard is equally available to all who must implement it. It must be globally deployable, or else it is no longer as universal as it could be. It must be open to change through due process. As we learn more about the task environment and the need for the standard, we must be able to adapt that standard to meet emerging needs without cutting ourselves off from the past. The specification must be open so all can use it. Now, one of the favorite terms that's used in the standardization process and amongst standards groups around the world is to use a RAND licensing scheme. RAND stands for reasonable and non-discriminatory. And there are public standards of what reasonable and non-discriminatory means in various countries. Generally speaking, however, it has been decided that a price of, say, $10,000 or $1,000, equally applied to all who might wish to practice that standard, is both reasonable and non-discriminatory. Unless you happen to live in a country where $10,000 is the equivalent of a year's university professor's salary, for example, compared with in the US where it's next to nothing. So all of a sudden the price becomes discriminatory to some potential practitioners of the standard. The standard must have an open interface that supports migration without depending upon any subversive secrets. It must be open for use and practice, and it must be supported in an ongoing fashion. Now, so far as areas of interest are concerned, let's consider for a moment standards creators. The drivers for creating a standard for those who want to create a standard are that they wish to develop a market, and therefore they seek incentives to invest in the new markets. They therefore, as a matter of the nature of the beast of business, seek some form of control, some form of determination over the standard and its use. The reasons for that are that shareholders demand predictability in the business. They demand some form of assurance that the business that they invest in will continue to produce profits that feed their egos. Also, most investors are well aware that competitors erode the predictability of the success of a business and therefore potentially undermine its profitability. Furthermore, every business that I have ever known of is fearful of change. Change in the competitive landscape is at best unpredictable and at worst uncomfortable. So fear of these areas of the unknown, fear of uncertainty, fear of failure in the face of a competitive scene causes many businesses to seek a control or security mechanism to lock out competition. In essence, if we are to distill this down in honesty, we must recognize that this fear is actually based on a lack of trust in competition and a lack of trust in our fellow man, a lack of trust in our customers, and a lack of trust in our suppliers. I'd like to propose that cooperation and trust are far superior in terms of the development of society as a whole than control. Cooperation and trust are non-discriminatory and cause everyone in the equation to benefit. As standards creators, we need to embrace the same motivation that is driving the open source community, which is one that says, I trust others to be able to add value to what I have contributed in a way that I could not have conceived of, and we will all benefit in the process. What are the drivers for implementers? Well, implementers need to produce a working product or a working outcome. I propose that standardization expedites development and leads to the ability to produce a new product faster when we all cooperate with each other. Implementers are governed by production and distribution cost efficiency. Again, standardization reduces costs and helps interoperability. It opens up a larger market potential for the resulting product. And I propose again, therefore, that we all benefit when we target the largest potential consumer base, and that open standards, open public royalty-free standards, can help us to achieve that. Open standards assist with the elimination and with the overcoming of technical obstacles. The standardization process hopefully will embody and embrace a concept of learning, so that the best way to solve a problem in the information technology arena will be most rapidly adopted. Also, by having many eyes cast an influence or a view over the problem, hopefully we will be able to identify a solution to a seemingly insurmountable obstacle far more rapidly. Lastly, there is always a political agenda that invariably plays a key role in the standards process, and all I can say to that is that duplicity plays no role in standardization. It's divisive and destructive of the progress that we as a society so much covet and need. Finally, there are consumers. The driver for the consumer is a reduction in cost. When each company that is producing in a competitive framework a business solution that's built around the same standards, what we avoid is the necessity for each to reinvent a unique solution to the same problem. That ought to be reflected in a more rapid learning curve effect, and the learning curve effect has been shown consistently over many centuries to result in a reduction of the price of a good sold. For example, who could conceive of the fact that the laptop that I'm using today, with all the power that it has, might have been sold 10 years ago for less than $1,000 as it is today? The fact that we are able to produce such a highly technical product at such a low price can only be attributed to the learning curve effect. We've learnt to do things that are far more complex, far more simplistically, and far more cost-effectively. Another critical factors that consumers look for is the absence of vendor lock-in. When consumers are locked into one particular solution, it really does not appeal to them too well. Or as a trucking company once told me, they have 3,500 trucks that traverse the United States. And I asked the CIO of that company how the business would function, if they had a particularly efficient truck that had a very unique engine that could run on only one type of gasoline, that could only be purchased at a gasoline depot in Atlanta, Georgia, and nowhere else in the world. And the CIO said, well, I'm sorry, our business would cease to function. There is no way we could run with that premise. I said, then why are you doing that in your information technology arena? Your only supplier for your technology is based out of Redmond, Washington. He's your gasoline station. And every system that you have built is built very efficiently and works very nicely, thank you very much. But if that vendor should ever go out of business or change the rules in a way that becomes prejudicial to your business operation, your trucks will go nowhere. He laughed and smiled and said, maybe I should reconsider what I'm currently doing. Consumers are also driven by political efficiencies. One proprietary size never fits all. As an example of that, we ought to consider for a moment whether a 5-man business or a 14-man business needs Active Directory for its Windows networking and electronic mail infrastructure. Yet Active Directory is the one size that the leading vendor in the back-end office infrastructure computing marketplace uses as the unified solution, no matter what size your foot. It's a simple fact of life that 89.1% of the gross domestic product of the United States is produced by businesses that have on average 14 employees. Do 14 employees need Active Directory? Do you realize that only 0.18% of all the corporations that file a tax return in North America employ more than 500 people? These are statistics that we need to grapple with. Too readily, we are prepared to consider the extreme upper large case as the model and the shoe that should fit everyone. Clearly it doesn't. In Thailand, the Thai population could not afford the price of Windows XP Professional loaded with all its extras. Microsoft released a cut-down version that was priced more affordably for the Thai people. Peru had a need to reduce the export, that is, the departure from their own shores, of their gross domestic product. They wanted to contain more of that locally. Their move to open source was predicated by that. And in Europe, we are seeing tremendously growing, almost scary, anti-American sentiments that are shaping a direction for open source. Clearly, one size does not fit all. So what is the impact of all of this on the past? What is the impact of standards on the past? Well, I'm sorry, we can't change what has been, but we can make smarter decisions going forward. Old Office files, for example, will require conversion to a new format. Hopefully, we will be able to choose a new format to convert those old files into so that we can avoid the necessity of having to do this yet again. The problem, however, in the past was that there was no universally acceptable Office file format. Microsoft continually changed the .doc format as new enhancements to Office were released, and that effectively led to the coercion of an update and upgrade cycle. I have seen in an accounting office the consequences of this lack of unity when an accountant had requirement or necessity to open up a document created 7 years earlier. He had to print it and make it look exactly as it printed out of Microsoft Word as it did when it was originally produced, and he had great difficulty even getting it close to the same output. There were legal requirements for making the document identical, and he had difficulty doing it because of the change that Microsoft had made, clearly of necessity, otherwise they wouldn't have done it, in that Office file format. We must, however, consider the impact on the present. The web is moving from HTML to XML. Office formats are moving to XML also. The open document format is an XML wrapper around standard XML data format. The Microsoft proposed XML standard that is now being placed with ECMA for standardization, and I believe that was due to have been completed before this day, is a wrapper around a proprietary binary data format like the .doc format. It's not open for use in free software, although I believe that Microsoft have now enacted a covenant that they will not sue anyone who uses it. It does, however, make sense to choose an open XML format that can be used by everybody. The XML schema policy submitted to ECMA for certification as a standard now asserts a not to sue covenant. I just need to clarify that. And again, this is not anti-Microsoft. We need to constrain ourselves to the facts, and I'm clarifying that here to clearly say that I don't want to be interpreted as speaking against a particular company. I'm speaking for open royalty-free standards. Now, as far as the future is concerned, we need to be willing to embrace the necessity of change. As more data is stored in open public royalty-free standards compliant XML formats, the cost of data conversion will drop dramatically. No vendor will be locked out of the market unless they choose not to play. Competition will increase with resulting reduction in the cost of office automation. Vendor lock-in will be eliminated. Consumers will have more choice, and consumers will probably, possibly, hopefully, get a better solution overall. Now, one of the questions that was raised in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts debate about the open document format is the question of assistive technology support, that is, support for those who are visually impaired. I want to just focus on that for a moment, because I believe that that whole argument and debate was a major distraction from the core issue of standards adoption. Let's look at the cost of a platform that includes the software that was proposed as providing the ideal solution. I believe that assistive technology is orthogonal, that is unrelated to the file format question. However, since the question has been asked, the cost of ignoring the cost of the hardware, which remains presumably the same regardless which operating system is run, the use of Windows XP Professional with Microsoft Office and with the JAWS software, which is the software that and Magic software. JAWS it does text to voice and voice to text, and Magic is a screen enhancement tool. All of this technology is built into Linux, for example, and the KDE desktop and the GNOME desktop. So we are looking at $2,154 as a typical software solution cost. But now with Novell's SUSE Linux desktop, by comparison, the Linux desktop sells for $59.95. It includes all of the above, all of the previous components. So in all fairness to the debate, before we address the question of the suitability of the assistive technology solution for the Microsoft Windows platform, I'm going to ask you to consider for just one moment, what sort of employment does a blind person gain, and what sort of income does a blind person earn? Which do you think he can better afford? I happen to have worked with a legally blind person. His income is only a few $1,000s a year. That's all he is able to muster. He was supplied by a state department with the Windows setup. The total Windows setup cost that state $15,000. The system crashes continually. I was rather taken back. I don't know how many of you saw the article written by Scott Cedar on Linux Planet last Thursday. Here is another visually impaired person who basically said, I'm sorry guys, I followed the Massachusetts discussion, but the solution proposed doesn't work terribly well. My productivity, tell me if I'm misparaphrasing him please, Rob. He said his productivity is horrible because he keeps losing data. His system keeps crashing. However, since he's been introduced to Linux, the system hasn't crashed, but it also isn't as usable as he would like it to be. Sorry? That was pretty much it? So what was the message that he gave, Rob? Yeah, I think he said that if the state governments of the United States invested the money that they'd been spending on assistive technology support for Windows in having assistive technology support enhanced for Linux and started to promote that Linux, we'd all be better off. Additionally, he made the point that when he raised the question of the Mac OS and Linux with the various support agencies that he was put in touch with, they were hostile to anything other than the Windows-based solution. And his bottom line, as I recall, was he was just totally stunned by the lack of willingness to consider another way, a better way to standardize on state government support for the visually impaired. So which solution is affordable? Remember, those who need assistive technology solutions are not affluent. The lower cost solution does not require specialist installation and support, which the JAWS application clearly does. The lower cost solution already implements the open document format. So what do we need? A permission note from Mum before we start to use it? All right, well, let's note that assistive technologies are specialty programs that interface with other application software to provide a means of on-screen enhancement via voice, touch-sensitive means, or by or other means to help those who are visually impaired. It doesn't touch the data format. The data format is simply a way that the information is stored. Comparing Office products, Microsoft Office is not free. Office is. OpenOffice is. Both products require periodic updating to permit access to current document formats. The continued provision by government officials of documents in Microsoft formats thus compels citizens to be Microsoft customers if they wish to read the document. The OASIS Open Document Format Standard for Office Automation reduces costs for all consumers everywhere. Reduced cost means that governments are able to invest more in providing better and more timely and more efficient information services. Open public royalty-free standards are an important community interest safeguard. So what is the present dilemma? Well, on baking an omelette, you have to break a few eggs. It's not possible to introduce a much-needed change without a document format standard being changed. The purpose of doing this is to provide greater accessibility. Microsoft will be affected by the acceptance of the open document file format. They will either support it in Microsoft Office or suffer loss of business. That is not a community problem, that's a Microsoft business decision, whether they elect to embrace that standard or not. They have the same freedom that you and I have to decide whether or not to use their confined solution. This is not any more anti-Microsoft than the introduction of the motor vehicle was to the horse and buggy. So is the present solution the best fit? Well, I've experienced the problems of supporting the current assistive technologies applications, and frankly, they're not that good. Likewise, the assistive technology support, in my opinion, under Linux still has a way to go. Windows is not the ideal solution. We don't have an ideal solution, and if that is the all-important issue in changing a document file format, which I believe to be an unrelated question, then perhaps we ought to make a more concerted effort to solve the problems of the assistive technology arena in an open standards compliant way and not cloud the issue by undue concern over who will be affected by the change of standard. Is Linux best for everyone? Never. Assistive technology in the Linux desktop is still developing and emerging. OpenOffice is not the appropriate solution for all users. It doesn't do everything that every user wants it to do, and it's their prerogative to use. It's your prerogative and mine to use whichever application we are most comfortable with. Just as no one should be forced to use Microsoft Office, no one should be coerced to use Linux. So it's time for us to reflect for a moment. What does standards in government mean? Authoritative rules that regulate the rights and duties of public officials in respect of change of law, custom or practice to remove an evil, to which are attached the same degree of dignity or rights in liberty to approach with a right to the thing added. At what cost does the continued use of Microsoft Office and its proprietary file formats meet the demands of standards in government? That is a decision that only you can make. The question is, in respect of open public royalty-free standards, whether privately or in government, what are you going to do about it? What choice are you going to make? Ultimately, the future is in your hands as consumers. As consumers, we determine what vendors will offer us. You know, if a vendor refuses to offer us the solution that we want and we don't buy it, that vendor will disappear. They'll go out of business and create, therefore, an opportunity for a more entrepreneurial-minded person or business that will offer us what we want. Either that, or we have to become the entrepreneur and start creating that product. You know, if no one has the customer, then we have the whole world at our feet. Thank you for your attention. I hope that I've triggered and inspired you in some way, and I hope I've imparted something other than nonsense to you today. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Any other comments or questions? You know, it's a very confusing picture. Microsoft were found guilty of a violation of or of misconduct in the marketplace. The Department of Justice ruled against them, but so far we've not been able to see any visible sanctions applied against them. So one interpretation is they got away with whatever they did. How and why is something that I'll leave to you to figure out. I believe that we should also recognize that the history of business in the United States has been a history of businesses trying to gain protection against competition from the government. Government itself participates in the process of monopolization. A Keynesian economic theory of government is an interventionist theory that has at its core the desire to see a monopoly, the monopoly of government. Right now we are seeing some interesting transitions in the federal government as they are playing with what they're calling the Chicago School of Economics. And a number of economics specialists have come up with elaborate formulas to determine when it is best to have a monopoly, when it is best to have a duopoly, and when it is best to have open competition. We've still not gone back to embracing a free market. So we are really treading with the Open Standards Initiative a pathway of having to dodge certain obstacles along the way. That's the nature of the beast. We shouldn't be daunted by that. We just need to push forward. As we create more community awareness, as more people buy in, the obstacles will eventually disappear. That's my belief. Any other comments? We have just a few minutes left. Failing that, I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and the next presentation here will be, Aaron, are you next? You are? 9:15, so we have about 20 minutes to Mike Balmer's presentation. Is it Mike, you are? Yeah. Oh. Yeah. You know, I really don't know. And I hope someone shoots me down and tells me I'm completely myopic in my perspective, but I believe that personal interface devices, as I prefer to call them laptops, desktops, whatever they are, I believe that they are ultimately going to end up as embedded, purpose-built devices. They'll come complete with everything you need, and there'll be some form of communication protocol back to large back-end servers. The thin client idea will eventually pervade because it offers the lowest overall cost and the lowest cost of maintenance in the long run. Now, Mike would probably is no doubt better qualified to comment on that than I am.